Hi everyone and welcome back. Today is the last lesson that you'll have for year one psychology. So we have finished all content. Well, once you have this lesson in, we would have finished all the content for year one. So well done everyone. You've made it this far. Congratulations, you've done such a wonderful job. So I'm just going to get straight into it. So as you know, we are just continuing on from biopsychology. So on this PowerPoint here, you can see the syllabus that we have to complete for year one psychology. We have done the divisions of the nervous system, we've done the function of the endocrine system, the fight or flight response. And in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the structure and function of sensory, relay, and motor neurons, the process of synaptic transmission, including reference to neurotransmitters, excitation, and inhibition. So all of that might sound like a lot of jargon, some keywords there that you might not understand, but hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll have a clear understanding on what all of these things are. So we will be picking up biopsychology again in year 2, so when you get to year 13. But yeah, well done again, guys. All right, let's go. All right, but before we get straight into it, we're just going to do a quick quiz, just a quick recap on what we've done on biopsychology so far. So there will be some statements. You'd either have to answer the question or say if it's true or false. You can scream it out at your laptop. You can say it in your head. I will never know. But please just try and make sure you answer the question so you are aware of your knowledge so far and what you may need to go over. So the nervous system is subdivided into 2 sections. What are they? So you can pause the video right here. Okay. So it is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The spinal cord passes information to and from your brain. Is that true or is that false? And it is a true story, okay? So the spinal cord and the brain are the central nervous system. So they're consistently passing information to and from each other. The peripheral nervous system consists of the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. Explain their functions. So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for automatic and vital functions of our body. So last week we used the example of breathing. Okay, so breathing happens automatically. We aren't aware of this mechanism happening in our bodies, but our bodies just do it. And that is mainly due to the autonomic nervous system. Okay, it's also vital because if we aren't breathing, it means that we are dead. Okay, so this is particularly vital for our bodies. The somatic nervous system uses information received from sensory receptors and is mainly concerned with controlling muscle movement. Hormones produce glands such as the thyroid gland. True or false? And it is false, okay? It's not true. Glands are the ones that produce hormones. And if we use the example of the thyroid gland, the example would be it produces thyroxine, which is a hormone. So it would be the other way around. And lastly, if your heart rate is super fast, you are in your parasympathetic state. Is that true or is that false? And it is false, okay? So no, it's not true. If our heart rate is really fast, our pupils are dilating, our digestion system is inhibited, that means that we are in our sympathetic state. So in our sympathetic state, our body is preparing for fight or flight. When we are in our parasympathetic state, it means that we are in our resting state. So yeah, well done to you if you got all of those right or a majority of those right. And hopefully it serves its purpose of where you need to improve and maybe revise a little bit more. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at neurons, synaptic transmission, and all of those things. So in order to understand all of those processes, we need to first know what a neuron actually is. So a neuron is a nerve cell that processes and transmits messages through chemical and electrical signals. So depending on how the neuron is transmitting messages, it will either be chemical or it will be electrical. And we're going to have a look at, the differences between the two when neurons transmit messages through different signals. So just a quick question. How many neurons do you think are in the human nervous system? So we know that they're in the human nervous system. Knowing that they transmit messages, how many, on estimation, do you think there are in the nervous system? The answer is 100 billion, okay? So a whole load of neurons are in our nervous system. So 80% of which are in our brain, and they provide information to the nervous system. So they are vital in, our body functioning. So there are 3 different types of neurons. However, with neurons, they all have the same basic structure. So we're going to have a look at the structure or characteristics of a neuron and what they look like. Right, so here we have the cell body, and within the cell body contains the nucleus, and we all know, hopefully from GCSE science, that the nucleus contains genetic material. Okay, so each of these neurons, we can see the sensory neuron, the relay neuron, sometimes called the interneuron, but we call it the relay neuron, and the motor neuron. They all have a cell body that has a nucleus within. And then we have dendrites that are at the start of each sort of neuron, and dendrites are used to carry the impulse towards the cell body. So if we see our impulses over here, what the dendrites will do is that it will carry the impulse towards the cell body. So that is the function of the dendrite. And then we have the axon. As you can see, this length over here, this is the axon, this is the axon, this is the axon, and as you can see, on the axon, you can see this pink fatty substance, and that is called the myelin sheath. And what the myelin sheath does, is it speeds up the impulse the impulse. So it also protects the neuron. So let's say we have our impulse, or where's my pen? We have our impulse over here, which is used from the dendrites to be carried towards the cell body. And then because of these gaps, which are called the nodes of Ranvier, the impulse moves so much quicker. If there weren't any myelin sheath, that would mean that it would take a lot slower for the impulse to travel down the length of the body. What the axon also does is it takes the impulse away from the cell body. So the dendrite carry it towards the cell body, but the axon takes it away from the cell body towards, the terminal buttons. And then lastly, these terminal buttons over here, as you can see, they're always at the end of the axon, and they're used to sort of communicate with the next neuron in the chain. So this is the basic structure of all neurons. So they have dendrites, they have cell body, they have myelin sheath, they have an axon, and they also have terminal buttons. However, their functions will vary, and we're going to have a look at that in a second. So on the OneDrive is a task where you should be labeling the neuron and describing the job of each structure. So what is the job of the dendrite, what's the job of the cell body, etc. So you can work through that. So again, this is just the structure of the neuron, just reiterating what I've just said. So dendrites protrude from the cell body, carrying nerve impulses, from neighboring neurons towards the cell body. The cell body includes a nucleus. The axon carries impulses away from the cell body. The axon is covered in myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is segmented by gaps called nodes of Ranvier. And terminal buttons communicate with the next neuron. So this is the basic structure of a neuron. Okay, so as I said, there are 3 different types of neurons. We've got the sensory neuron, we've got the relay neuron, and we've got the motor neuron. They all pretty much, have the same basic structure, but there are anatomical differences. So even if we use the example of human beings, we all have the same basic structure. We all have 2 eyes, 2 ears, well, mostly a nose, a mouth, 2 arms, 2 legs, etc. However, there are large anatomical differences between us. So there might be some tall people, there may be some short people, we vary in a race, and yeah, so we all have the same, like, I guess, sort of structure, however we vary. And in the same way, it can also be said for neurons. They all have the same cellular structure, however, there are anatomical differences. And this is a result of the different functions that they carry out. So the sensory neuron is pretty much, related to the peripheral nervous system, and which we know is to do with fight and flight. So it receives information from our environment, and carries those messages from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. So that is what the sensory neuron does. The relay neuron connects sensory neurons to motor neurons or other relay neurons. So the relay neuron is mostly about connecting other neurons to each other, pretty much. And then the motor neuron connects the central nervous systems to what we call effectors, which are muscles and glands. So sensory neuron carries messages from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, but in order for it to do that, it also needs, in order for it to connect to the motor neuron to pass on its messages, it needs the relay neuron to connect each other. And then the motor neuron carries this information from the central nervous system and then relays it to muscles and glands. So as we said, they all look completely different, and we're going to have a look at how they are different and possibly why they are different. So if you look at this picture here, you can see that the motor neuron sort of has like short dendrites and long axons. The relay neuron sometimes has short or long axons, but also has short dendrites. And lastly, we have the sensory neuron, which has like long dendrites and short axons. So they all look pretty different from each other, and it's so important for you to know the differences between these different neurons, and what they look like, because you could be asked in an exam, label the motor relay or sensory neuron, and you could be asked about their function as well. So it's important that you know this. So even if asked to think about the sensory neuron, it sort of looks like the cell body and the nucleus, looks like an eye on the outside of the axon. So automatically for me, I'll just think senses and sensory neuron because it looks like an eye. For the relay neuron, it's sort of like got, it looks like it's connecting. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, just make sure you know the differences between them. And then lastly, we've got the motor neuron. So just to make sure you know this, think about what you'd link each one with. So what would be the first one? Which neuron would be the second one? And which neuron would be the third one as well? So this would be the motor neuron, this would be the relay neuron, and this would be the sensory neuron. So well done if you got that right. So in order to sort of explain the process between the neurons, we have to look at, we have to look at a real life example. So here we have a hot object, which is a burning flame from a candle, and we've also got the pain receptors in our skin. So if, for example, you will touch the burning flame, this will be detected by like sense organs in our peripheral nervous system, and as a result, our sensory neuron will travel down or carry this message from the peripheral nervous system along the sensory neuron towards the central nervous system. And as it's going towards the central nervous system, it meets a relay neuron, which then connects it with a motor neuron. And then the motor neuron will convey this message to a muscle or a gland, as we know, which is the effector. And this will then lead our hand to pull away from this hot object. So you can see the starting, how it connects to the relay neuron, then to the motor neuron, and then essentially to our effectors, which will allow us, which will allow our muscles to contract and withdraw. And then, here's another example, the sensory neuron. Here we've got the relay neuron, the motor neuron, and then to our muscles, and maybe allowing our muscles to contract and withdraw as a result of being stimulated. So in this way, we can also use the knee-jerk reflex as an example. So if someone was to hit a hammer on your knee, for example, you'd feel that automatically your knee will jerk. Don't try this at home, but you should know that automatically your knee will jerk. And as a result, it's because this hammer is being detected by sense organs, which is in the peripheral nervous system, and then that is conveyed along a message. Conveys a message along a sensory neuron. The message reaches the central nervous system, connects with a relay neuron, then transfers the message to a motor neuron, and then carries the message to an effector such as a muscle. Okay, so that is just the example. You can have a read of this again, but it pretty much always follows this sort of cycle. So the sensory neuron, the relay neuron, and then the motor neuron, which then will lead to effectors. So that could be a muscle or a gland. So just to ensure that you fully understand this, here is an exam question. So Jeremy is digging in the garden. He feels the spade hit a rock and stops digging immediately. Explain how sensory, relay, and motor neurons would function in this situation. So what I would like you to do is highlight any information you think is important. What type of question do you think it is? What assessment objective do you think it's trying to test you on? So think about this, make a plan of how you would answer this question. And it is 6 marks. So we know that there needs to be knowledge of sensory, relay, and motor neurons and how they will function. And there's a hint box as well to sort of help you answer this question. So you can pause this video and possibly answer this question. How would you answer this question? What is it asking you? Make sure you're highlighting the keywords and you're also understanding the assessment objective so you know what they are actually asking from you and what they want from you. So here's the mark scheme. AO2, okay, it requires application. We need to apply our knowledge to Jeremy digging in the garden. So for level 3, 4 marks, 5 to 6 marks, the explanation of how each type of neuron would function in the situation is clear and with effective and generally well detailed application. If you're on level 1, it would say the explanation of how types of neurons would function in this situation is limited. So you might tell me all about sensory, relay, and motor neurons. However, it's limited in its application to the particular example they've given us. So always remember to include the example in your answer, because clearly we want to know about Jeremy, otherwise we wouldn't throw him in there anyway. So application is key. So possible application as follows: sensory neurons send information from the senses to the brain, relay neurons connect with other neurons, and then motor neurons send messages via long axons from the brain to the muscles or effectors. Okay, so you can take your time to fully read this, but you should sort of relay it to Jeremy and also explain the sensory, relay, and motor neurons. So, synaptic transmission. Okay, and we're moving on. So as I said in the beginning of the video, that neurons communicate either electrically or they communicate chemically. And this is pretty much how they communicate with each other. So chemical messages are often sent across the synapse. Okay, so the synapse is just very small. I can't remember how many milliliters exactly, but it's extremely thin. So there's a presynaptic neuron and then there's a postsynaptic neuron. If they want to communicate with each other, the presynaptic neuron, using neurotransmitters, will chemically transmit that message towards the postsynaptic neuron. However, if they want to communicate within their network, it will be electrically. So the neural network is just how neurons communicate with each other. Signals within neurons are transmitted electrically. However, signals between groups are transmitted chemically. When the electrical impulse reaches the end of the neuron, aka the presynaptic neuron, it releases the synaptic vessels to release neurotransmitters. So, an action potential. This is when mostly to do with electrical transmission within a neuron. And in a neuron's resting state, it is negatively charged. So let's say a stimulus activates the neuron, the inside of it, as you can see in the picture there, the inside of it will become positively charged as a result of an action potential, which occurs the electrical impulse. Okay, so let's say we have an impulse that activates a neuron. The inside of it, so in its resting state, we said that it is negatively charged. However, when a stimulus activates the neuron, the inside of it, as you can see here, becomes positively charged. And as a result, an action potential will occur. Okay, so this means that the impulse will simply just travel down the axon towards terminal buttons. And at the end, there are little synaptic vesicles, and in it they have these neurotransmitters. So then, because of the impulse and this action potential, it will lead to these neurotransmitters being released from the synaptic vesicles, and then they are released into into the synapse, which is the gap, so the synaptic cleft, diffused into the postsynaptic axon, and then they're picked up by postsynaptic receptor sites. So it sounds like a lot. In the next slide, I believe there's a YouTube video, so you can read it and you can watch it, and you can visually see what this process looks like. But it's pretty much because of an action potential, synaptic vesicles introduce the release of neurotransmitters across the synapse, which is then diffused and picked up by receptor sites, which are in a postsynaptic neuron. So, this is one neuron. Let's say there's a gap here, and then here's another neuron. Okay, so that would be the postsynaptic axon, and then the receptor sites pick up these neurotransmitters. Then the neurotransmitters, because it's gone across the gap, it then becomes converted into an electrical impulse again. So to communicate across the gap, it is chemically, but within, using the action potential, it is transmitting messages electrically. So here is a picture that I hope makes a little more sense. So here we can see the synaptic vesicles and neurotransmitters within these synaptic vesicles, and then you can see these post-receptor sites. Okay, so the neurotransmitters, they're communicating across the synaptic cleft, and these post-receptor sites that sort of, diffuse and pick up these neurotransmitters. Sometimes they attach to the receptors, and other times they're also reabsorbed and reused within the presynaptic system and presynaptic neuron, and sometimes enzymes also destroy neurotransmitters. So here's the link to the video. If you click the link on the OneDrive, so using the lesson, then you'll be able to see how this fully works. Okay. Right, so independently, what I'd like you to do is I'd sort of like you to do this task, find the definition of a neurotransmitter, what happens when it crosses the gap, where have they been identified, and give an example of a specialist function of a neurotransmitter. All right, so excitation and inhibition. What that really means is sometimes neurotransmitters have an excitatory or inhibitory effect on its neighboring neuron. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter, obviously, and it causes inhibition. Okay, so we said that in order for an action potential to occur, the inside of the neuron needs to be positively charged. However, what serotonin does is it ensures that the neuron becomes negatively charged, and therefore action potential is less likely to occur. So serotonin is also linked to our mood and is also given to people with depression to stabilize their mood. So even with OCD and in psychopathology, we learned about biological treatments to treat in OCD, and the same with sort of depression. It works the same as depression. So SSRIs are given to patients, and what that does is it sort of inhibits, because serotonin is an inhibitory or has an inhibitory effect on the neighboring neuron. What SSRIs do is it ensures that instead of serotonin being reuptaked or reused by the presynaptic neuron, it ensures that it stimulates the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so that would mean that there's more serotonin, which we know would mean that it treats things like OCD, and it helps treat things like depression. Okay, so if there's more serotonin in someone's system, that means, you know, it might make them feel a bit less anxious, it might make them feel slightly happier. So that is what SSRIs are used for. And then we have adrenaline, which is also a neurotransmitter, but it has the opposite effect that serotonin has on its neighboring neuron. So that means a neuron is more likely to fire because it's excitatory, okay? So it's more likely to pass on that electrical impulse. If you have any more questions about this, please let me know, and hopefully I can make sense of this. Before you go, you can do this little exam question. And so briefly outline excitation and inhibition. Briefly outline excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters that are involved in synaptic transmission, and that is 4 marks. So you can start by saying neurotransmitters can be excitatory or inhibitory, and you please provide examples, okay, and how they can be excitatory or inhibitory. Here's the mark scheme. You can have a read of this. And there you go. Okay, so this was quite a long lesson. But yeah, you finished, guys. Yay! So well done. You can somewhat relax a little bit, and make sure you're making all of these revision posters, and making sure that you're on top of your work, doing things or filling out like gaps in your knowledge where you don't think you fully understood something. Please make sure you make use of emailing me as well, if you're stuck on anything. And yeah, that's the end.